Welcome back, friends. This week, we've got a guest. I brought along Dr. Gilly Kahn to talk to us about ADHD in adults, what it looks like, why it's missed, and the challenges we can face as a result. I've got to tell you that when social media was flooded with ADHD content, I was concerned that it would open up the floodgates of misdiagnosis. And my experience instead has been the opposite. For the highly intelligent, successful people that I work with, considering this diagnosis has been challenging. There is such a pervasive stigma around this diagnosis, and I'm hopeful that today's episode opens your mind and expands your view, that it has you reconsider. Also, a quick note, we didn't go into the types of ADHD, so for a little perspective, there are three: hyperactive impulsive, inattentive, and combined. Hyperactive impulsive can look like fidgeting, always going, speaking out of turn, or interrupting. Inattentive can show up as difficulty paying attention, forgetting, losing track of things. And the most common is combined, a mashup of the former two. There is so much more to share on this subject, and I'm glad to be opening up this conversation. So let's begin. I'm Ashley McCann, trauma and eating disorder specialist, therapist, and coach. I created this podcast to share what I've learned and continue to learn to help you on your journey. My hope is that it helps you find more freedom and ease in life and in the skin you are in. This is In Our Skin. Now, here is my interview with Gilly. Welcome. We have with us today Gilly Kahn. Gilly is a PhD licensed clinical psychologist, and she is a mother, a writer, and an educator. Gilly specializes working with individuals and in group therapy, focusing on neurodiversity and emotion regulation. Gilly also has ADHD, as do I. She has a PhD in clinical psychology. If you ask her what her hobbies are outside of work, she will literally tell you that it is everything psychology. She admits it, it's an obsession. Gilly's writing her debut book, which is so exciting. It is about the emotional truth behind ADHD in women, and she practices in the Atlanta area. Welcome, Gilly.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on your show, Ashley.
Yeah, it's so fun to have you. I really am excited to talk to you about this subject because not everything is one therapist or psychologist's expertise. And I love to bring people in who have a passion for talking about the things that people want to hear. And I can tell you that amongst the women that I work with and who are in my life, understanding adult ADHD diagnoses, especially in women, has been a really hot topic. We can probably thank TikTok and Instagram for that. And I thought it would be great to have an actual trained professional come in and talk to us about this subject. So thanks for being here.
Of course, yeah. And it doesn't surprise me that this is a topic of interest right now because there is such a knowledge gap in ADHD in women and adults in general.
Yes.
It makes sense that people have a lot of questions about it.
Yeah. So with all of these people potentially going through their lives and getting into late adulthood undiagnosed, I think that there are a lot of questions, and people out there listening might not know much about ADHD. And so one of the things that I've found as both a therapist and an adult is that a lot of us are missing information and misunderstanding what ADHD looks like and what it really is, and the differences between the different types. So it'd be amazing if you could give just a general broad overview so that people understand that it might not look like what they think.
Exactly. I could give a description of what ADHD is as it's defined and understood
Yeah.
right now in the DSM, the magical book, right, that
Mhm.
psychologists use in their training and just to understand what the criteria are
Yeah.
for each diagnosis. But I think although this is really, really helpful in guiding us to specific treatment strategies and solutions that would help people.
Mhm.
It also has the limitation of putting people into
Yes.
neat boxes, and people are just more complicated than that. So,
Yes, they are.
so in terms of what is ADHD, I think it's an ongoing question.
Yes.
We have
Yes.
an understanding of what it is in boys, But we're only now really starting to understand the complexity of ADHD in girls, and
Yeah.
especially women, like once they hit puberty.
Yes. And so, Gilly, I'm sure that you have so much to share on this, but one of the things that I found so interesting in the research on this is that a lot of girls actually won't qualify or have symptoms of ADHD until puberty. And so, we look at ADHD, many of us, I think, as this childhood diagnosis, and we aren't really thinking about it in terms of often females and adults. So, the DSM could tell us one thing, but what I would love to know is, how you help people understand ADHD and neurodivergence, because what I love to help people see is that our brains are just different. The way my brain works is different than the way your brain works and the person standing next to you. And that's actually normal. But understanding the ways in which a neurodivergent brain works can help us depersonalize and stop internalizing these things like they are our shortcomings or weaknesses, and instead understand that it's simply about brain functioning.
So when you said a lot of girls don't get diagnosed until a later age, a big piece of that is that when parents are confused, it's because they are under the impression that their child should be hyperactive,
Right,
or they significantly struggle at school, or they can't pay attention across tasks.
right, right.
Right.
And so the differences between the types of ADHD are an interesting thing to consider, or for some, that inattention is going to be more pronounced. And for another, the hyperactivity might not even exist, right? Or it could, some posit, exist in the state of our mind. For myself, while I am a high energy person, I never struggled to sit through a class. And partially because of acculturation, probably. I didn't really think that to be a good student or a good girl, I should act any differently. So I might have put more effort and energy into holding it together. But I don't struggle with hyperactivity per se. But I can tell you that my mind all day has more tabs open than maybe most.
Right. I think maybe the way that we're understanding hyperactivity
Mhm.
also is becoming more complex,
Yeah.
because there are psychologists who argue that it's more a deficit in executive functioning, which is basically, your ability to plan and organize
Mhm.
information. And if you have a million tabs open in your head,
Yeah.
then it's going to be hard to,
Yes.
to pay attention or to focus on one task at a time,
Hmm.
or to stay organized. But that is a form of hyperactivity, in that it's like sensory overload,
Hmm.
and that's what stimulants address. And that's actually a question that comes up a lot for people who don't really understand how stimulants work, or why would you want to take a stimulant that makes you more hyper if you're
Hmm.
hyper, right?
Yeah.
Um, because that's what it does. It increases dopamine, which basically makes you more excited, but it actually has the opposite effect. It ends up regulating that need to move
Yeah.
in
Yep.
people who are fidgety, because it's fulfilling that need. So it's like if you
Yes.
have a bucket where you feel like it's empty because
Hmm.
you're really bored, ADHD medication, it basically fills the bucket, and then you're just like not as fidgety.
Right. So, for a lot of people with an ADHD diagnosis, there's a suggestion, at least some research that has backed this, that there's a dopamine deficiency for a lot of people. If you've been listening along in the podcast, you'll have heard me talk a lot about dopamine in the past two episodes. And so, if you think about what it would feel like to have a dopamine deficiency, it's like we're going to be drawn toward things that fulfill that. So we might be looking for things like Gilly's saying that are more stimulating, more activating, more pleasurable. And seeking that out can end up furthering some of these challenges for people. So if you end up seeking substances, you'll find yourself further depleted of dopamine. And so it can be quite a vicious cycle if not understood. So, taking those medications, like some say, why would you take a stimulant if you're stimulated? Well, it actually will have almost an opposite effect of focus and grounding. So, Gilly, where you were talking about like the tabs open in the mind and what that's like with executive function, I think that this is a really interesting thing for people to understand. Our prefrontal cortex plays a main role in just that. It's that part of our brain that's not fully developed until we're in our mid to late 20s. So we have it, but it's not fully developed until that point. But it's where we make those higher level choices. It's how we make choice, actually. Decision making comes from there. And for someone who has ADHD, though you still have executive function, it can function differently. And I think if we spend a moment on that, it will help a lot of people go, oh, makes sense. Because for me, this was huge. An analogy that I often hear people use is a symphony with a conductor. And this idea that in our mind, there can be a symphony playing. There's a lot of different instruments, and we could be attending to each of those instruments, or we could be distracted by each of those instruments. And for non neurodivergent people, there's a conductor, and the conductor is this executive function working in a way that allows the conductor to say, you stop playing, you play. And so for someone with ADHD, the challenge can be that every instrument's playing and it's hard to focus on one or to stop another. Would you say that that's an accurate description in your experience?
Yeah, there's a book written by Ned Hallowell and John Rady, ADHD 2.0. And in that book, the authors talk about the DMN and the TPN. So that's the default mode network and the task
Yes.
positive network. Yeah, so that's sort of what you're referring to. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. Basically, what they're explaining is that there's a network. I like to think about it like a railway system. So you've got all of these little messages being sent in your brain that connect to different parts of your brain. And so in people who are like neurotypical or people who are not ADHD, their task positive network, which is kind of what it sounds like, it's your ability to stay on task. Like if
Okay.
let's say you're sitting and reading a textbook, then you can sit and really get absorbed in the material and focus on what's in the book. If you have a thought like, that was really mean, what she said to me earlier today, you're able to redirect
Okay.
and say, no, 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 it's textbook time and focus on that. So, and people who are neurotypical, their task positive network is basically working really well. And then their default mode network, which is sort of like the tempting, the temptress,
Mm-hmm.
like it's trying to like reel you in with information, usually about yourself, self-referential information. That's where the rumination comes in, where you think like, oh, wow, that was really bad that I did that. And those thoughts are more likely to come up if you have ADHD because people are more
Mm-hmm.
likely to misunderstand you. But then also, these build up and magnify in your mind, and you start to develop these ways of thinking that just kind of amplifies. So the DMN, they call it the demon, which is funny. It's
Oh,
like the
okay.
tempter will like distract you and try to pull your attention in. And then there's this constant battle
Okay.
between the task positive network, like focus on the textbook, and then the DMN, who is just like, think about this thing instead. But
Yeah.
this is more urgent.
Yeah.
So just imagine the chaos that can happen in your brain when you're trying to focus on something that's time sensitive. The other thing is Bill Dodson refers to, he's a psychiatrist who specializes in ADHD. And he refers to having an interest-based nervous system and about how ADHD is more that than an attention deficit. So it's not that they can't pay
Percent.
attention, right? There's this misunderstanding. A lot of parents that come in to see me, they say, oh, but he can sit still and pay attention to video games for hours.
Yeah.
Of course he can, because
Mhm.
they're that interesting and fun and dopamine releasing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it's an interest-based nervous system. It's selective attention, not inattention.
Right. Right. It's just a little bit harder to do the low interest thing.
It's
Right. And
very
so,
bit harder.
it's about being able to focus all the way through. In many cases, I think that is tricky. For a lot of people with ADHD, you'll see patterns of beginning beginning things, when the interest and the drive and excitement perhaps are there, but not then being able to take things through to the finish line because
Yep.
that has dissipated over time. The interest has decreased. Something else might be more appealing, might be
Yes.
more interesting, or simply might have a deadline, right? And so attending to different things and sticking with them can be really challenging.
Yeah. And these are details that a lot of clinicians don't really think about when they think about ADHD. I mean, that is one of the criteria right now that you start and it's hard for you to finish.
Yeah.
Um, but it doesn't immediately come to mind. I was working with a teen who told me that whenever she goes anywhere, she carries 5 books around because she gets bored of reading one and then she'll move on to the next
Mm-hmm.
one and then, move on to the next one and had like a million tabs in her book
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that helps her pay attention.
Yeah.
These are things that affect a lot of people, and you don't even realize that that's a part of
Yeah.
ADHD. Like I know it was for me, and
Yeah.
I heard a lot of women with ADHD also talk about their pile of books
Yeah.
sitting by their
Well,
bed.
I love that you're saying this because I actually just gave myself permission to read more than one book at a time. Like I kind of had this rule for myself because it felt like the right thing to do to read one book until it was done. But I will consume more books if I just let myself choose which one I feel like reading that night. I would love to know more about your experience. What was it like for you learning and understanding, and what's that journey been like for you since?
To connect to what we were saying before about starting and not being able to finish,
Hmm.
that has been my fear, like
Yeah.
growing up, because I did have a tendency to do that. For me, ever since I was in middle school, and now I'm writing my first book, and that has been my goal since I was
Yeah.
14. I actually wanted to be a writer before I wanted to be a psychologist.
And you got the degree, right? You got a degree in creative writing?
Yeah. So I
Okay.
started as a psychology major because, I was under the impression that writing is not a very stable career choice. So basically, I said, you know what? Everything I'm reading has a psychological component. So I took AP Psych and just fell in love and started as a psychology major in college. But then after the first year, I was feeling burnt out and like I didn't have something else to lean
Yep.
onto. And that's where the creative writing comes in. And I think that's so important. And I talk about juggling when you have ADHD because they're like well, how you're doing this podcast and at the
Yeah.
same time seeing clients.
Hmm.
Because if we do the same thing back to back
Yeah.
to back, we're
Yeah.
going to go nuts. And then the other thing is that let's say something goes badly. It's sort
Okay.
of like what your brain tells you. Oh my God, I had a bad interaction with a client, or wow, I really messed that up. You're someone with ADHD, like their brain could totally spiral and catastrophize.
Hmm.
But I think it's helpful to remind yourself and to also make sure that you have other things in your life. In college, this started for me. I was just like, okay, the research in psychology right now is not a thing for me.
Yep.
So let me invest more of my emotional energy in creative writing. And I'm
I
not
love it.
removing psychology from my life. It's still a part of my life, but let me just give it a breather and
I
spend more
love this.
time on my short story, and then I'll come back to it.
Now, did you come to that in and of yourself, or was that a strategy that was given to you because you were aware that you had ADHD?
I wasn't diagnosed until I was 33. I didn't know. And a lot of women, I think it
Yeah.
has a lot to do with intelligence. And I'm not saying, oh my God, like I'm so smart,
Yeah.
but I got a PhD. So I think I'm smart in my
Yeah.
field,
Yeah.
in the thing I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
Outside of that, maybe not so much. I think that I just developed the skills. And there were
Yeah.
some situations, honestly, that were unfortunate that forced me into developing the skills. I lost my mom at a really early age, and my dad was in the Israeli military. And
Wow.
so, because of that, our upbringing was very, very strict.
Okay.
There was no room for forgiveness and flexibility. So,
Right.
if
The
I forgot
expectation was such, and so you met it.
I had to. I had
Yeah.
to, or else I would be grounded if I didn't, remember my books. And so I had to figure out a way to remember my books.
Yeah.
So I came up with the ideas myself. I would just write myself post-it notes, put them on top of my outfit for the next day.
Yes.
And, I was actually just listening to a podcast episode on Attitudes podcast.
Attitudes is a great resource, website, podcast. If you're curious about ADHD, they have some really great quizzes that I actually share with people often that I find fascinating when you look at the questions and how they are so relatable to life experiences, things that they look at that are so far outside of the box of what the DSM might say.
Yep, Ari Tuckman. He was saying that, people with ADHD, they work better when they externalize, meaning when they put things on paper.
I love this. Yeah, for people who are neurotypical, similar is true. Writing things on paper, research has shown, helps us internalize them more, remember them better. But that is such an interesting strategy because when you're saying the thing with the post-it notes, I'm like, I don't know if there's research on this, but any ADHD recommendation somewhere in there, there's going to be to use post-its. So I bought a lot of post-its this year. I don't know
Yeah.
if they're really my thing, but I love the use of them. And I think writing things out has been something I've always been drawn to. But do you go back and look at it again?
Yeah, you have to put it in front of your face or in an obvious place, like he
Yeah,
was saying, like on the front door, or I put it on my outfit for the next day so I can't
I
miss
love
it.
this. I
Um,
love that you developed that without understanding why you needed it, but that you found something that worked for you in that way. I don't think I found a lot of things that helped me manage. I just would have to get to like a certain point. It's like that point of the stress being high enough that I would have to do the next thing or make the change or organize the thing or get the paper done. And I got all A's. I think I got one B plus in grad school and was like devastated. But you can imagine what that would look like. It wasn't smooth. It was like every deadline I was working so hard. So you're this kid with these expectations that are, ill-fitting for what you're working with, and you're doing a lot of it on your own. So you find this
yeah.
strategy. Oh,
I just
yes.
remembered what Ari Tuckman said. He was saying, like, for some people, it helps to jump around from place to place to increase motivation and productivity. And that's one thing I did. And so, I'll say, like, as a joke, but also I did this seriously. I
Yeah.
used to work in my closet because it was novel. And sometimes I would write, even, I would like dim the lights and turn
Hmm.
on music. And then,
I love hearing this because I work in maybe 3 or 4 different rooms of my house throughout the course of the day
right.
right now. So I do different tasks in different places. I found that I was spending enough time at my desk that this level of depletion and stress that I would experience by the end of the day. And just by working in different areas, different spaces, seeing different sites, taking breaks, it's had a really powerful impact.
The other thing that's helpful to think about is I like to know, how does my body work and why does it do the things that it does?
Yeah.
And then I use that information to help myself. So it's
Mhm.
always important to start out with understanding,
Yeah.
why would you even do these things? And then you could even be creative and come up with strategies that will help you. So we know that people with ADHD, their dopamine is just metabolized a lot more quickly, like flushed out of their system, like having a fast metabolism, like when you
Yeah.
eat. So they're lacking in dopamine, and stimulants basically are stimulating because you're understimulated if you
Yeah.
have ADHD. So then the question is, what's stimulating? So, for example, right now, and this is what I love about telehealth. Right now, I'm sitting crisscross applesauce. You've
I
been
would
saying
love
for
to
the
tell you
spring
something
break.
really. We're going to take a left turn because this is the beauty of ADHD. I actually got ripped off on the internet trying to buy a chair that was especially made for people with ADHD and people who like to meditate. And I was like, I could be both of those. The chair never arrived. I got a fake tracking number. It went right to Colorado, and I don't have my chair, but I was so excited to be able to get a chair where I could move around more and sit in
Yeah.
different positions. It's huge. It
Yeah,
helps.
you need a wider chair. That's it. I've been waiting for a standing desk to be available. I'm gonna try it out. Like, I'm gonna fall into that trap. But basically, they have these like foot hammocks, and they have these like foot like skateboards, so you
Love
have this
this.
sensory intake.
You
as
know,
you're working.
I now that I'm thinking about this, I've seen some really interesting things at the kids' schools, like rubber bands on chairs that you can just bang your legs into. And they have these things now, actually, that you can put under the legs of your chair so that there's like a lean ability and a bounce ability to your chair.
Sounds fun.
Oh, there's
Okay.
all kinds of stuff out there. And this is the thing, a lot of it is geared toward kids in schools. And so we don't actually see it for adults, right?
Right.
Like we see the standing desk. It would be interesting to look into like what else are out there for resources because a lot of it is geared toward children.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that right now, sadly, there's a lot of shame and stigma around if you are an adult and you
Mhm.
do need to fidget, because socially, if you fidget, it gives off the message that you're not interested, which you probably aren't.
Yeah.
It sends that message that it's rude, right? So
Yeah,
when I'm
yeah,
sitting, for example, in a therapy session, I love what I do. I'm totally engaged,
yeah,
so there's no problem. But if I'm sitting like in a team meeting and I'm just not interested, it is so, so hard for me. So hard
yeah.
for me to stay still. And I'm just like, you know what? Maybe I'll raise the standing desk. And like I start raising it and I'm just like, oh my God, people are gonna watch me, you know? And then
Oh,
I
I
sit
love it
back
though. It's
down.
very validating. I hear you.
It's
Well,
really
I
hard.
think that what you're saying, underneath this is what's really important to me in sharing this episode that people really don't understand it. And so it is judged. And I think the limited understanding that, even professionals have, it's perpetuating these ideas that allow there to be these stereotypes that allow these to be bad things when why is moving a bad thing? Why is it insulting? Why is it personal? Right. So why am I
Right.
not as good of a friend or a listener if I'm moving, And if we could just share more about what this is and what it looks like, because it is not personal and we don't need to develop those lines of thinking about ourselves in relation to these things. I mean, I think that's the most freeing part of a diagnosis. All these things making sense and they're not really who we are. It's not the type of friend we are, the type of partner or parent. It's this is what we're working with in a brain. And if I can step back from that and see it more neutrally and stop judging it, I can actually manage it. I can share with others about it. I can help them understand. I can share a podcast like this. So, what do you think are some of the things that would be important for people to understand about the presentation of ADHD that could be judged? That, what do we need to know?
Just kind of taking a step back, there's this understanding of interpretations of other people from a social psychology lens. It's the fundamental attribution bias.
Hmm.
And basically, that describes people's tendency to look at someone else. And if, let's say, they fail at something or they do something that's considered socially unacceptable,
Yeah.
they'll attribute that to the person's personality
Mm,
or like to their character.
yeah.
Oh, she got to work late, therefore, she must be irresponsible.
Or not value work or others' time. Right. And I think that this is a huge part of what happens for people with ADHD, like time blindness. So, can you explain to people what time blindness is?
Yeah, time blindness is basically what it sounds like. It's hard to keep track of time,
Hmm.
especially if you really get engrossed in something that's very interesting to you,
Mm.
which is where the hyper focus comes in, where you get zoned into your area of interest. So time just kind of flies, and that could make you late to something.
Hmm.
Or
Thinking that you can fit in three more things or that you're going to get somewhere. And the amount of time it took you, the one time you got there faster than ever, even though logically it takes longer.
yeah, there's a big cognitive component to it too. One thing I know that's true for me is I'll think I'm going to be so bored if I get there early. So I should probably make sure that I leave exactly at the time that I need to leave.
Yes.
That way I get there right on time. If I think, well, what if it rains? What if it's okay? I'll make up for it.
Mhm.
And then you might be late if you
Yeah.
have the thinking patterns, learning how to catch those and,
Yes.
talk back to them. But also ADHD is a performance-based issue as opposed to a
Yeah.
knowledge-based issue. So it's going to be It's easier said than done. Like you can say, oh, well, you should tell yourself that next time you
Oh, I think this is a really important point because people will say, just buy a planner or just set your calendar. And now these can be effective strategies for some people. This is performance. This isn't knowledge. We know better. We do know. We have a
right.
lot of ideas of how we could manage this, and they
Mhm.
might not all work. It's not
Right.
about a lack of knowledge for in some ways, and for some people there certainly is a knowledge gap we're talking about here.
It's not a knowledge-based deficit.
We know logically, say we're given an assignment, I should begin this
Right.
assignment. I know this is going to get hard if I don't begin it.
Mhm.
And yet we're not compelled enough to do it. And there are other things that are more interesting and maybe other things that need to be done. And so it's put off, right? So that knowledge that in that way is, I know what I need to do and I know that it would be wise to do it. And I think that's what most people have. There's this other knowledge gap that will show up where, I think what we're talking about here today, it's what do we do about some of these patterns, right? Are there strategies I don't know about? Are there things that I can be doing differently?
Right. It's more about practice, and actually trying the thing, right? In real
Mhm.
time.
So, what do you see as like some of the social challenges that people face? Because this social aspect of ADHD, I think, is something that is little known.
So what does occur is in terms of like social cognition, thinking about social situations is like a hostile attribution bias, which is basically someone's tendency to jump to conclusions and think like they're out to get me. For example, this is the classic example. Let's say you're playing on the playground and then a ball hits you on the head. Then you turn around and you see this other kid staring at you. For a kid with ADHD, their brain is more quickly going to tell them he did it on purpose.
Okay. Yes.
And everything happens really fast when you have
Yeah.
ADHD. So it's like, oh, he did it on purpose. I take the ball and I launch it back at him
Okay.
without
That's
a second
really
thought.
interesting, that hostility bias. And there's also this rejection sensitivity that people experience.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
didn't think about the connection between the two. That's so true.
right. So, can you share a little bit about what rejection sensitivity looks like? Because while that example with the kid and the ball as a child, that child grows into an adult. There's adults out there right now who are likely to feel like things are personal. And then this rejection sensitivity comes in and will turn that on high, right?
Mhm. Yeah. And you're also making me think now about gender differences because
Hmm.
a boy, who gets hit in the head with a ball might very well launch it back because they tend to respond more physically. In general, there are individual
Yeah.
differences
Sure.
between boys,
Sure.
but I'm thinking for a girl, if
Yeah.
let's say they aren't part of the popular group
Yep.
and they get hit in the head with a ball, that's where the rejection sensitivity could come in. And that girl could interpret it as they're making fun of me.
Yes. And this actually, there is a lot of research that shows those differences. If we look at differences between males and females in bullying, it happens very differently. It looks very differently. So any of us can be sensitive to rejection, but just to understand that for people who are neurodivergent, there is an emotion regulation segment of this. And it can be, we might think of it as someone acting out, throwing that ball at someone else in response to something, but it can look different. It can be so much more covert. It can be so much more internal and not even perceived from the outside, where someone might be really struggling to get past difficult situations, feeling like others see them a certain way and are doing things intentionally. So it's a real over personalization that is on high and can be highly associated with ADHD and neurodivergence, which
Hmm.
is not something I think people think of when they think of ADHD. It's very covert.
Right. Yep. My book is going to be about that. It's going to be
Wow.
about the emotional piece of ADHD that has been not really given enough attention the past few years, like very recently.
Yeah. What are we seeing and understanding about that? We talked about executive function and how that can make it difficult to focus, for example. But what is this piece with emotion regulation and how does it have anything to do with ADHD?
This isn't anything that's new. It's just that now it's getting more attention, but it's been known for years and for different updates of the DSM
Hmm.
that ADHD is also related to emotion dysregulation, but there's only a brief mention of it right
Yeah.
now. It's not even part of the criteria. Basically, it was left out of the criteria to simplify them
Okay.
because emotions, you start to get stuck in the muck of like, is it depression? Is it anxiety?
Hmm.
Maybe that's what makes it more complicated. Right now, the criteria require the person being diagnosed to display these behaviors in at least two settings. So it would
Yeah.
have to be at home and at school, at home and at work. And to get an accurate endorsement of that, you would
Hmm.
also need like a teacher's report or a partner's report. And how are they really going to be able to accurately describe your emotion?
Wow. Yeah. 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 I think that it's really interesting thinking about that. And, I think back to what you were telling of your story. And it's like, how could you have ever been diagnosed? It didn't feel like you were allowed to have those symptoms. And so it's not that they didn't show up, but they were very masked. And that's the reality for a lot of females especially, and a lot of males. So not all boys, not all males present with the hyperactivity. They can be inattentive, just like we're describing. There are some gender differences in prevalence, but I think that it's just very interesting when you think about how it's diagnosed and why it might not be diagnosed when it could be.
Yeah, it's skewed. The gender differences, I believe, are skewed because if you look at adults, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, like men to women, it's equal. But then you look at
Interesting.
kids and it's so much more prevalent in boys. Why? How does that
I
make it?
didn't realize that adult stat. I've never heard that.
Yeah. But also
Yeah.
so much less likely, to be
Uh-huh.
diagnosed in adults. So we're
Yeah.
catching up now in diagnoses. But then, how would that make any sense? It's probably more equal between boys and girls. It's just that
Yeah.
we're misunderstanding the
Sure.
presentation.
Well, the same but opposite is true with eating disorders.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We haven't talked about medication yet, and it's a big question for people. Often it's what can I do other than medication? I did get some listener questions, and that was one of them. And I wonder what there is that you would want to share.
This is always a topic that makes me nervous when I talk to
Mhm.
parents about it because there's just a lot of misunderstanding and stigma surrounding especially taking stimulants, but any type of psychotropic medication.
Yeah.
I understand it's a big decision, but in general, I think it's really important to kind of bust those myths,
Yeah.
saying that stimulants are dangerous or that you can get addicted to them. The only way you can get addicted to a stimulant is if you inhale it or inject it into your bloodstream.
Well, and the other thing, remember what we already talked about, that for someone with ADHD, the differences in the brain mean that the stimulant interacts so much differently, and it's actually bringing you from a deficit to a normalized state.
Yeah, yeah,
So we're
and
not actually stimulating in the same way you might think of with the
right.
word stimulant.
Right. And actually also have a few resources I can share with you, Ashley, that you can share with everyone else, just
Great.
links to
Great.
articles, because I think, you should educate yourself. Sometimes
Yeah.
professionals don't know what they're talking about.
Right. And this isn't to put down other professionals. I have Gilly here today because this isn't my area of expertise, and we can all only know so much.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of, what are concerns associated with stimulants, it's complicated because there was a study that came out basically saying that it could increase your risk of cardiovascular disease,
Hmm.
but this was in one very specific population and it didn't take into account a lot of other stuff like the fact that people with ADHD, even without medication, have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Or for a piece of that could be related to eating habits, just lifestyle choices. And so there are all these other factors that should be considered. And then, as opposed to that, there's also this really large meta analysis with millions and millions of people. And it showed that there wasn't a risk for
Okay.
cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
So, you need to look at everything.
To
And that
weigh
was
it out.
the concern. That's it.
Okay. So, all in all, with medication, like with any medication, there are certainly risks and they can be very individual.
Yeah. The other thing to think about is it's important to know what research that's based on and to know the full story, then also to do like a risk benefit analysis.
Yeah.
For example, taking the stimulant because it really addresses the ADHD, which could be much more debilitating, can still move through your life.
Sure. Sure.
Than ADHD, it could be a bigger
Yeah.
risk. So it's all a risk benefit ratio and asking
Yep.
yourself, are my ADHD symptoms really interfering with my life? And it doesn't just have to be with executive functioning, it could also be emotion regulation
Hmm.
and your reactivity in social situations. It really covers situations across your day,
Yeah.
regardless of where you are.
Okay. I know other questions that we have in this community have to do with an overlap in ADHD and eating behaviors. For my clients with ADHD, some of them are prone to seeking stimulation through food, whether or not bored, but to quell whatever's happening in their mind seeking soothing. Others will be in patterns of forgetting, like truly being so involved in whatever they're doing, hyper focused on what they're doing, because hyper focus absolutely will happen. And they'll go past eating meals, and that can lead to overeating. And for some, even binging at night because they've pulled themselves like a pendulum into a deficit. Is there anything that you would share?
When I think about binges and ADHD or seeking out food to quell your uncomfortable feelings
Yeah.
brings me back to, the dopamine
Mhm.
imbalance due to a dopamine deficit where you're doing more of it because it fills that void.
The pattern of seeking pleasure
Yes.
to actually try to get your mind and body to that state of equilibrium.
Equilibrium, exactly. I think you said it perfectly. It's basically, getting your body to a place of equilibrium
Yeah.
because your dopamine levels are just not where they should be. So you're seeking out pleasure.
Yes. I hope that people hear that, whether it has to do with food or not, when there is this
Anything.
dopamine deficit, we're going to naturally be seeking that equilibrium.
Right?
And so for some people, it's going to look like just reaching for our phones more often and not really
Yes.
understanding why we're doing it. It might look like, engaging
Video
in
games,
video game.
shopping,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Or
Anything
even
that is
taking,
stimulating. So
yeah,
now enter TikTok, short form entertainment. It's very hard for an ADHD brain to not get tied to that because there is an experience, maybe one time of your mind going, this is great. And you get that dopamine dump. Now, you might not be getting it because I think a lot of people with ADHD will agree, like they can get on the scroll and still feel that displeasure that the world's talking about and go back again. And so, if you listen to the last episodes, you'll hear me talk about dopamine, but this is a really interesting part of ADHD that explains why, for some people, repetitive patterns that are related to our history with dopamine or our current seeking of dopamine can make a great deal of sense with it. And so
yeah,
medication can certainly even that out. And we also can really tap into other practices that, whether you're taking medication, both are so good together, where it's that identification of, okay, there is this part of me that is still taking me in this direction of something that is no longer serving me. And what do we do with that?
the way I think about it too is like you're a victim to your ADHD because it
Yeah.
could feel like you're out of control.
I was like, huh, I feel validated. Yeah, it's really easy to get stuck in loops that you don't want to be in. And now, we've been talking about this throughout, and I've been talking about this throughout the podcast, the things that we judge ourselves for And we don't understand stuckness. For someone with ADHD, the stuckness and patterns you want to get out of can be like
Yeah.
threefold, just
And there's so
so
much shame
significant. And then the
attached
shame
to
will
it.
keep us even more entrenched in patterns, looking for escape from those thoughts and feelings. And it's really interesting hearing you talk about the default mode network and that demon that, yeah, it contributes to keeping us stuck in the same. Now we have neural pathways in our brains. So things that we have done time and time again, we're more likely to do again and again. So there are a lot of other explanations for the repetitive behaviors that we can get entrenched in, but it's
Especially if there's
very,
pleasure derived from them.
yes, yeah, yeah. I know that you specialize in ACT therapy, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that because what you do with that to me relates a lot to what I was sharing last week in the episode in Motivation about the more here and now chemicals and finding connection to the present that can come with this. So I'd love to connect the dots on this for people who are looking for something like a concrete approach.
ACT is like a branch of cognitive behavior therapy. It's like a twist on it. I remember while I was learning about CBT, there were certain pieces of it that felt not right to me.
For our listeners, anyone who doesn't know what CBT is, that cognitive behavioral therapy is so cognitive, that's our thoughts, our cognitions are another word for our thoughts, and the behavior is our behavior. And so that particular therapy looks a lot at the ways that we're thinking and the relationship to our behavior and vice versa. So this is, very foundational in Western psychology.
Exactly. Yep. So CBT is all about the content of thoughts, meaning what am I thinking? So if let's say you're thinking, no one likes me, then how can you prove that wrong? Or
Okay.
what reality does that actually have? And is there a way that we can change that way of thinking? That specific thought, the idea is over time, if you do this enough, then the way that you think about situations changes, the
Yeah.
content of your thoughts.
And so there's something about this as you're in school that you're like, okay, yeah, and
Yeah, I get
something's
it, but
not
also
quite.
something's off. I remember even for myself, I would think like, okay, I'm having this, maladaptive thought or a
Hmm.
thought that's, not so helpful. I prefer to call it that, just a thought
Yeah.
that's less helpful. But it doesn't matter how many times I try to challenge it, I'm still thinking it.
Yeah.
Or, why do I have to tell myself that it's wrong to think this?
It does put a heavy focus on our thoughts. So we're thinking a lot about our thinking.
Right. And ACT complements it because it kind of fills in the gaps for
Hmm.
me. And so I like to teach people both. And so ACT is less about the content of thoughts. It's less about the thought. It's more abstract than that. It's kind of meta. That's how I like to
Okay.
call it.
So the concrete nature of cognitive behavioral therapy being like we restructure our thoughts.
Not about replacing a thought with a different thought. It's changing your relationship with your thoughts and your feelings.
Awesome.
So, just like we have relationships with people, we relate in a certain way to our thoughts and our feelings.
Yes.
So, if we think, oof, no, that's a bad thought, get it out of your head.
Yeah.
What ends up happening is actually like a boomerang effect. The more you try not to think about something, the more it's gonna follow you around like a little annoying thing. ACT really targets the way that you relate to your thoughts and feelings by helping you learn strategies to create distance
Yeah.
between you and your thoughts and feelings so you recognize them for what they are. They're just temporary experience. And it's the same way with anxiety. Like, am I anxiety? No, anxiety is something that I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
I can sit down and observe, and it's not going to stick around forever.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the same thing, right now, maybe I'm feeling anxious, but in an hour from now, I might feel happy. I might feel
Yeah.
angry. It's temporary.
Yeah. So it's like this practice in acknowledging non-permanence because of the over-attachment that we will have to the current state of our mind or that current thought. So it helps get a little space between.
Right. Or like the way I explain it to clients is I'll say it's like dependent on the weight that you give your thoughts. So if
Yeah.
you have the thought, no one likes me, okay, you have the thought. Do you have to get rid of it? No. And also, it's going to be hard to get rid of it. It's
Hmm.
okay that you have that thought, right?
Yeah.
Lots of people have weird and unhelpful thoughts. It's just a
Hmm.
part of being a human. The question is, what do you do with the thought? As
Hmm.
opposed to let's change the thought.
Yeah.
It's more, okay, you had this thought. Now, practically speaking, is that thought helpful? No one likes me. Is that going to bring you closer to the stuff you care about, or is that going to push you farther away? And most people would say it's probably going to push me farther away.
Yeah. If we look at acceptance and commitment therapy, where does acceptance and commitment come together, and how does it help people when they have ADHD and maybe they are struggling with some of the sensitivity and emotion regulation or the self-limiting beliefs that come of years of feeling like you can't do things the typical way?
Yeah. So there is a lot of research showing that mindfulness and this is mindfulness, basically
Yeah.
active. It's a mindfulness based intervention that also incorporates goal setting and values identification. But there are so many parts of ACT that are just so helpful for ADHD. Mindfulness is a big one that has been supported through the
Hmm.
research because practicing mindfulness is all about practicing focusing and paying attention. And a lot of people with ADHD, including me, when they hear mindfulness, they're just like, "Oh, I'm not going to sit still, and
Hmm.
meditate. That's not
Yeah.
me." But the thing with mindfulness is it's not the same thing as it doesn't have to be
No.
meditation. Mm, like you could be awake and in this world and practice mindfulness by using your senses.
Yeah.
Um, so it helps to ground you,
So
basically.
mindfulness is paying attention to something on purpose. So you don't have to be still. You don't have to meditate, like you're saying, but it's paying attention to something with intention. And we can all do that. Now, someone with ADHD might be paying attention initially to a lot of different things back to
Yeah,
back, or they might be paying attention to maybe not the thing that they
need to
could,
pay
should,
attention.
would pay attention to. So, mindfulness can be this really grounding way of pulling ourselves back and asking that question. And if we can do that with a little curiosity instead of judgment when we get to the
Exactly.
answer, it can take us forward. To use this type of therapy and to practice acceptance might not look quite like what people associate with that word. For a lot of people, practicing acceptance can be really challenging because there's this belief that it's almost like acquiescing, like throwing our hands up, like if something isn't as we want it to be and we're practicing accepting it, then we're accepting it as it is, as if we're quitting. So, how do you look at acceptance?
Okay, there's the issue of control, right? Things you
Mhm.
have control over, things you don't have control over. And so in some situations, you might have control over some things and not
Yeah.
others. When you don't have control, you can sit there and problem solve, and that's where you can get stuck, and
Yeah.
it's a waste of time and energy. So the first step is identifying, what do I not have control over? And in that case, it's not a bad idea to accept and to be more passive. But in
Okay.
situations where you're able to problem solve and actually fix the situation, which is what most people want to do, right? Let's fix the problem. But
Yeah.
sometimes the fixing is acceptance. Other times it shouldn't be because you can do something about this.
Yeah.
But then you could also use acceptance along the way in the background. For example, let's say it's a situation where you're feeling kind of socially anxious about talking to someone, but you also really want to make friends.
Yeah.
So in that case, you could just sit back and say, I'm never going to make friends. I'll just accept that and I'll sit in my house like a
Yeah.
hermit. Or you can, carry your anxiety around like a purse, like, it's coming with you
Yeah.
to speak to this person and, it's allowed to be there, but you're going to
Yeah.
push through like the Nike slogan, just do it.
Yeah.
So there's the action and the commitment. I'm going to
Yeah.
set a goal. I'm going to do it.
So acceptance can be like a practice of opposite to emotion action. Like acceptance is, I don't love this as it is, and And the and
Yeah.
there is I'm going to keep going, or I'm going to do the thing even though it's hard. And I love this because I think for people with ADHD, a lot of life is opposite to emotion action, not bullying ourselves or ignoring how we feel and going opposite, but acknowledging how we feel. And if it is in our best interest, choosing to do the thing
Yeah.
anyway, knowing that what's at the end better serves us than avoidance.
Or using it as fuel, especially
Mhm.
if you have ADHD, because we like novelty, excitement,
Yeah.
challenge.
We are just coming off of talking about motivation and understanding that motivation isn't actually going to come before action in many cases. So what's this piece about commitment?
Mhm. Yeah, it's about acceptance, but it's not just about, oh, sitting back and observing. It's also about doing. And that's why it's called ACT, because it's about
Yeah.
action, about identifying what's important, what are my values, and then setting specific goals
Yeah.
based on
Great.
that. A value would
Love
be
this.
something like family, right? Which is
Hmm.
different than a goal, which would be like, I'm going to watch a movie with my mom on Saturday.
Hmm.
So that goal is very specific. It has a clear beginning and an end. Once I've gone to the movies with my mom, I can do it again the following Saturday, but I've already accomplished the goal. But you don't accomplish family. Like family can go on forever. So it sort of gives you a sense of, what am I really going to enjoy? What am I really going to feel fulfilled doing in my
Hmm.
life? Can help you create kind of a better plan, because we know that ADHD is an interest-based nervous system. So you
Right.
have to pick something that sings to you.
And so, pulling in a little bit about what we were talking about last, your values can be a way in which you build intrinsic, that internal drive and motivation. When we connect to why something is important for us, we are much more likely to be able to activate, take action, and do something. And I love that differentiation between values and goals because I don't usually hold them side by side. That is very interesting. Can we make our goals, values aligned?
Right.
Can we then
Yeah.
set goals? Can goals then be motivating? I almost hesitate to use the word goals often because of pressure and expectation that
Yeah.
can come with it. But if you're making values aligned goals, if you're doing it with intention, I think that that's really helpful. Gilly, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. We can't wait to find out more about your book. You can find more about Gilly on her website, drgilly.com. You can also find her over on Instagram at Dr. Gilly Kahn. And thank you, as always, for listening. If you're looking for more to get truly connected, you have options. This month, you can sign up for my course, Change Your Relationship with Food, a self-paced journey with live weekly support through April. You can also join the Women's Circle, reopening this month. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions, so send them along, and be sure to follow along for new episodes each week. You can now watch them over on YouTube. All of this and more in the show notes. Until next time, take care.